And the great news for this administration, Mr. Speaker, is that, gee, he doesn't have to run for re-election again, so there should be no excuse whatsoever for not bringing the facts forward. May I inquire how much time?
About 9 minutes.
Thank you. So since the President doesn't have to run for re-election, there is no reason not to bring out the facts of Fast and Furious. What happened in Benghazi that is now spilled over and cost American lives in Algeria? Let's get to the bottom of it. And if Secretary Clinton does not know what happened, if she doesn't have a clue, bless her heart, let's get somebody that does. Let's find out how these mistakes were made so we can prevent future lives being lost when they don't have to be. And, Mr. Speaker, I want to conclude today, since this week marks the 40th anniversary of the landmark case of Roe versus Wade. Those of us who have been involved as a lawyer trying cases, civil cases, such as Roe versus Wade was a civil case. Those of us that have been involved as a judge, as I was also a Chief Justice, we know that in order for a case to be ripe, that it can be heard in court, there must be a justiciable issue, as there was in Roe versus Wade, but the person bringing the case actually has standing to bring the case. Took years, but we ultimately find out that at the time there was no standing. We find out from the person who was Roe, fictitious name, she deeply regrets what had happened and that case has been responsible for the killing of millions of lives. And I have so many dear friends on the Democratic side of the aisle. I know their hearts. They don't want people to get killed. They care about life. And so many on both sides of the aisle talk about trying to protect, quote, the most vulnerable among us, unquote. I would humbly submit there is no one more vulnerable than an unborn child. There is that cord through which nourishment and oxygen flow as that baby grows and develops. There is a desire in the human heart to live. There is a desire to live. And those precious, innocent children want to live. It's who they are. It's part of their genetic makeup to want to live. There's no baby, born or unborn, who is capable, mentally or physically, of taking their own lives intentionally. It can't happen. It doesn't happen. They want to live. So our heart breaks as a nation thinking about the spilled blood of innocent, vulnerable children, all put to death because someone did not understand what was going on. And they were led to believe it's not a life, it's a choice. The children want to live. When our firstborn was born, she came 8 to 10 weeks prematurely, and back then it was uncertain whether she was going to live. We were encouraged at first, but the doctor said she's in trouble. Her lungs were not developed. And I knew from cases that I've been involved in, that if too much oxygen is given to a preemie, there's a chance they'll go blind, so doctors avoided that if at all possible. And I saw them go from 20 to 40 to 60 to 80 to 100% oxygen. When they got to 100%, I knew Katie was in big trouble, or they wouldn't risk her blindness. And they said we needed to ship her to either Dallas or Houston or Shreveport, where she could get the top-rated neonatal ICU. Shreveport was a little closer. I was torn. My wife was suffering, having given birth prematurely. Stay with her or go with the baby. She said, go with Katie. Do anything you can to help her. So, follow the ambulance to Shreveport. A man named Dr. Singh was the neonatologist, T-S-I-N-G. He cared so deeply for those babies, and I began to understand why the doctor said they seem to have the best survival rate there in Shreveport. He had a policy that if you went by a child, you had to observe proper sanitization procedures, but you touch those children. You talk to those children. They hear you. They know you. When I got there, they sat me on a stool and said, you can stay no more than 2 hours, but talk to this child. She knows your voice. She has heard your voice for maybe 7 months. She knows your voice. Talk to her. Caress her arms. Talk to her. Caress her little face. And I did. And the monitors were going so fast. So erratic was the heart rate. So erratic was the breathing. Lungs so undeveloped. And as I've been there for a couple hours, Dr. Singh came back over. And Katie had a grip on my finger. That tiny little hand of hers around the very end of my finger. And she wouldn't let go. And he came over after a while and he said, have you looked at the monitors? And I looked up. She still had such undeveloped lungs, but her breathing had stabilized. Her heart rate had stabilized. And Dr. Singh said, she is drawing life. She is drawing strength from you. I couldn't leave. I sat there for eight hours before they forced me to take a break. But I learned, born or unborn, a child wants to live. I hope and pray we will not continue to allow the killing of 40, 50, 60 million more precious babies like Katie. Katie's alive today. She's a joy. She's brilliant. There are other children that wanted to live as well. And we need to stop deceiving pregnant women that it's not a life. It is a life. And it's endowed by our Creator. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 3rd, 2013, the Chair recognizes the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Franks, for 30 minutes. The gentleman is recognized.
Well, I thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I know that another legislative day has come to an end. and that sunset fast approaches in Washington, D.C. And I stand before this House with what I call a sunset memorial. Because you see, Mr. Speaker, before the sun sets today in America, almost 4,000 more defenseless unborn children would be killed by abortion on demand in the land of the free and the home of the brave. That is more than the number of innocent lives lost on September 11th in this country, and it happens every single day. Mr. Speaker, it has now been 40 years, an entire generation, since the tragedy called Roe versus Wade was first handed down. Since then, the very foundation of this nation has been stained by the blood of almost 55 million of its own unborn children. Some of them, Mr. Speaker, cried and screamed as they died, but because it was amniotic fluid going over the vocal cords instead of air, we couldn't hear them. All of them had at least 4 things in common, Mr. Speaker. First, they were just nameless little babies that had done wrong to no one. And yet each one of them died a nameless and lonely death. And each one of their mothers, whether she realizes it or not, will never be quite the same. And all the gifts that these children might have brought to humanity and this world are now lost forever. Yet even in the glare of such tragedy, this generation still clings to a blind, invincible ignorance, while history repeats itself over and over again, and our own silent genocide mercilessly annihilates the most helpless of all victims, those yet unborn. Mr. Speaker, I recently heard Barack Obama speak such poignant words that whether he knows it or not, apply so profoundly to the tragedy of abortion on demand in America. Let me quote selected, excerpted portions of his comments. He said, quote, "This is our first task, caring for our children. It's our first job. If we don't get that right, we don't get anything right. That's how, as a society, we will be judged. And by that measure, can we truly say as a nation that we are meeting our obligations? Can we honestly say that we're doing enough to keep our children, all of them, safe from harm?" He went on to quote, "Can we say that we're truly doing enough to give all the children of this country the chance that they deserve to live out their lives in happiness and with purpose?" He said, "I've been reflecting on this the last few days, and if we're honest with ourselves, the answer is no. We're not doing enough, and we will have to change." Oh, Mr. Speaker, how true the President's words were. The President also said, quote, "We can't tolerate this any longer. These tragedies must end, and to end them, we must change." And then the President asked, quote, "Are we really prepared to say that we are powerless in the face of such carnage, that the politics are too hard? Are we prepared to say that such violence visited on our children year after year after year is somehow the price of our freedom?" What a powerful question, Mr. Speaker. It is the most relevant question we should all be asking in the midst of this genocidal murder of thousands of unborn children in America every day. The President said, quote, "Our journey is not incomplete. Our journey is not complete until our children, all our children, are, quote, cared for and cherished and always safe from harm." He said that is our generation's task, to make these words, these rights, these values of life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness real for every American. Mr. Speaker, never have I so deeply agreed with any words ever spoken by President Obama as those I have just quoted. And yet this president, in the most merciless distortion of logic and reason and humanity itself, refuses to apply these majestic words to the helpless unborn babies of this nation. How I wish that somehow Mr. Obama would just open his heart and his ears to his own words and ask himself in the core of his soul why his words that should apply to all children cannot include the most helpless of all children. Only a few days ago, no more than 200 yards from this well, Barack Obama put his hand down on the same Bible that Abraham Lincoln was sworn in when he took his presidential oath. Mr. Speaker, we should remember that we honor Abraham Lincoln most because he found the courage as President of the United States in the days of slavery and the humanity within himself to recognize the image of God stamped on the soul of slaves that the Supreme Court said were not human and that the tide of public opinion didn't recognize as protectable under law. Could it still be, Mr. Speaker, that President Barack Obama might consider that perspective, as well as his own legacy and even eternity itself, Mr. Speaker, and recognize that in his day, under his presidency, that these little unborn children look so desperately to him now for help? Could it be that the President might finally remember that on the pages of the Bible on which he laid his hand were the words written in red, "Inasmuch as you have done it unto one of the least of these, my brethren, you have done it unto me"? Mr. Speaker, whether he does or not, it is certainly time for those of us in this chamber to remind ourselves of why we are really all here. Thomas Jefferson said the care of human life and happiness, and not its destruction, is the chief and only object of good government. The phrase in the 14th Amendment capsulizes our entire Constitution. It says no state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Mr. Speaker, protecting the lives of all Americans and their constitutional rights is why we are all here. The bedrock foundation of this republic is that clarion declaration of the self-evident truth that all human beings are created equal and endowed by their Creator with unalienable rights, the rights of life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. Every conflict and battle our nation has ever faced can be traced to our commitment to this core, self-evident truth. It has made us the beacon of hope for the entire world, Mr. Speaker. It is who we are. And yet today, another day has passed. And in this body, we have failed again to honor that foundational commitment. We have failed our sworn oath and our God-given responsibility as we broke faith with nearly 4,000 more innocent little American babies who died today without the protection we should have given them. So, Mr. Speaker, let me conclude this Sunset Memorial in the hopes that perhaps someone new who heard it tonight will finally embrace that very inconvenient truth that abortion really does kill little babies, and that it hurts mothers in ways that we can never imagine, and that it is time we stood up together again and looked to our Declaration of Independence, and that we remember that we are the same America that rejected human slavery and marched into Europe to arrest the Nazi Holocaust. And we are still the courageous and compassionate nation that can find a better way for mothers and their unborn babies than abortion on demand. It is still not too late for us to make a better world. and for America to be the one that leads the rest of the planet, just as we did in the days of slavery, from this tragic genocide of murdering nearly 4,000 of our own children every day. So now, Mr. Speaker, as we consider the plight of the unborn after 40 years under Roe versus Wade, maybe we can remind ourselves and that our own days in this sunshine of life are all numbered, and that all too soon each one of us will also walk from these chambers for the very last time. And then if it should be that this Congress is allowed to convene on yet another day, may that be the day when we finally find the humanity, the courage, and the will to embrace together our human and our constitutional duty to protect these, the least of our tiny little brothers and sisters in America, from this murderous scourge upon our nation called abortion on demand. Mr. Speaker, it is now 40 years since Roe versus Wade first stained the foundation of this nation with the blood of its own children. This, in the land of the free, in the home of the brave. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair would entertain a motion to adjourn. Questions on the motion? For what purpose does the gentleman rise?
Mr. Speaker, I move to adjourn.
The question is on the motion to adjourn. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The motion is adopted. Accordingly, the House stands adjourned until 2 p.m. on Friday of this week.
Well, that finishes today's House session. Earlier today, members approved a bill suspending the debt limit of $16.4 trillion until May 19th of this year. The vote was 285 to 144. It would allow the government to pay limited obligations. The measure would also withhold House and Senate salaries after April 15th if a budget hasn't been passed. The Senate is expected to pass the House bill. Earlier today, Secretary of State Clinton testified at a Senate hearing about the attack on the U.S. consulate in Benghazi, Libya. And you can see that hearing in our video library. Go to cspan.org.